Mr. Ambassador, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the Regent's community. As Vice-Chancellor, it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you here to Regent's University London for our annual Europe and the World debate. This year is on the priorities for the United States-European relationship. We believe that one of the great responsibilities of a university is to become engaged in debates around the key issues. We're one of the most internationally focused universities in Europe, and indeed we have a very strong transatlantic relationship with more than 75 institutions in the USA and many more also in Canada. We're pleased to reinforce our international commitment, not only with discussions like the one this evening and also our Jean Monnet lecture that we have at another time of the year, but also with our latest reports that we produce, the Regent's Report. These reports are designed to address current global economic and social issues and to provide challenges and stimulate debate within and beyond the academic community. Last year we focused on the relationship between the UK and the EU. The information that the report contained has been featured in debates in the House of Commons and also amply covered by the media. We hope that we're now going to be able to update that report in the near future and to circulate it extensively before the general election next year. This year's report, the Transatlantic Relations, a European perspective, and it is a European perspective, it's people from here looking at America and looking at our relationships, is going to be published shortly. You'll find the executive summary in the packs that you've been given, but by chance, although this is not a launch event for the report, we have received the report today, and there will be copies of it at the reception for you to take away if you would be interested in doing so. I'd like to thank the UK offices of the European Commission for their support in all of our European activities. They enable us to reach further with our continuing work in this area and to support activities such as tonight's discussion and indeed our reports. Finally, I'd like to thank Ambassador Gardner, US Ambassador to the European Union, and all of our other expert speakers here this evening. I now call on our Chancellor, Professor John Drew, to introduce the speakers and to commence the debate. John.
Thank you very much and good evening. I have a very pleasant duty this evening, which is to chair the meeting, which means I don't have to prepare what I'm going to say, and I can just say things as they come along. But there are one or two things I would say. The first is that we have the Chatham House rule here, which means that anything which is said by the speakers can be referred to externally, but not actually mention the name of the person who said it. But within a few weeks, we shall be able to publish the findings of this, which we will send to you. And I just hope that as you leave, you'll leave a visiting card at the reception so that we can make sure that we can post it to you. Indeed, the report is out and just came out this morning by chance. We knew it would be in November, but didn't know it would be today. And so when you come to the refreshments afterwards, you're most welcome to pick up a copy. And of course, you can always get it online or have other copies if you so require. So yes, we've had the two Regents report. And this one, when we started it, we thought, well, with TTIP and the way in which US-EU relationships were going, it was an appropriate moment. And we were very fortunate in this year for the Institute of Contemporary European Studies, here of which I'm the director, we were very fortunate to have two things at the same time. One, the report, which was ongoing, and then I went to see the ambassador in Brussels and asked him if he was prepared to come and talk at the same time, but not to launch the report, but to say what he felt about matters. He said yes, he would do, but having been in the post that time, 2 or 3 months, he said he'd like to wait a little bit, which is why we waited till the end of November. I'm not going to introduce the speakers because you have in your papers here the background, and it's also extremely time-consuming and it's often boring for the speakers to keep hearing what they've done in the past. But Ambassador Gardner, the United States Ambassador to the European Union, will be the first to address us. After that, 3 others will in turn comment on what has been said, and then after that I hope we can have a lively debate. So may I ask you please to welcome Ambassador Anthony Gardner.
Thank you very much, Professor Drew, for that introduction. I'm pleased to be here at Regent's College to speak about U.S.-EU relations, and I am looking forward to reading the report that's fresh off the press. I'm pleased to be joined here as well by 2 friends, Fernando Guimarães of the External Action Service and Sanford Henry of the Chatham House. Today is, as you know, the 96th anniversary of what we used to call Armistice Day, the end of World War I. I took my family to visit the Passchendaele Memorial Museum this past Saturday so that my children could understand the sacrifices that past generations made for the values that we take for granted. This weekend marked the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the escape of millions of people who wanted to leave their Soviet prison to become free Europeans. The East Germans called the wall the anti-fascist protection rampart. Today, Vladimir Putin exhibits the same worldview and the same respect for the facts. We are reminded every day, and I'm reminded every day, that democracy, tolerance, and the rules-based international order are under threat. Our freedoms are not free. They need to be defended, and U.S.-EU cooperation is fundamental and more necessary than ever before. During the 23 years that I've been involved in U.S.-EU relations in one form or another, I can't think of a time of greater opportunities and greater challenges. Ever since President John Kennedy, the United States has been a supporter of European integration. This has been so not out of starry idealism, but out of the conviction that a united Europe can be a strong partner of the United States. Naturally, there have been, there will continue to be, areas of disagreement, but the areas where we agree, I believe, will always outnumber those where we disagree. Never before have the United States and the EU collaborated on such a broad array of issues, not only related to our bilateral economic agenda, but globally about sanctions against Russia, combating ISIL, responding to Ebola, dealing with numerous refugee crises, seeking to limit Iran's nuclear program, and many other crises. Our cooperation with the UK on EU issues continues to be strong. We share many of the same values, views, and objectives, and that is why we continue to favor, as President Obama has stated, a strong UK in a strong EU, and our view is shared by many EU members. I've believed in the European project as a force for good since I started studying the EU as a graduate student. My 13 years in the UK have not diminished my enthusiasm. They just provided me with a good source of anecdotes about how the tabloid press routinely characterizes the EU. And I recall one day walking to the Tube on my way to work and seeing a front page of a tabloid newspaper with large lettering saying that there had been a plot by the Commission to merge southern England into northern France, to create a new country called Arc-Manche with its own flag and its own anthem. That is before the tabloid newspaper intervened just in time to prevent it. And I started my career in Brussels in the early 1990s because it was a compelling place to be. The single market was being completed and the EC was opening up to the east. And I feel the same sense of possibilities and the same sense of excitement today. Why? First, external threats, including continuing Russian aggression in Ukraine and the spread of militant Islam, have refocused minds on both sides of the Atlantic on the importance of our shared values and the necessity of working together to address a wide variety of global challenges. Second, this is a time for change in Brussels. President Juncker has presented a bold vision of how the new European Commission should work. We look forward to a fruitful collaboration with him and his entire College of Commissioners, as well as with President Donald Tusk. Just as we enjoyed with our predecessors, we have much work to do together. The change in the EU institutions offers an opportunity to turn the page on some of the disagreements of the past. The EU has its own list of irritants it wishes to address. I've made it a major priority, I think my first priority, to address some of the concerns expressed around how the US deals with EU citizens' data privacy. We have our own list of irritants we would like to address. Let me just mention one, because it's so important. The outgoing College of Commissioners failed to act on 8 pending applications to authorize the importation for processing into food and feed of genetically modified commodities. These applications have been pending for many years, along with a backlog of 59 others for import, cultivation, and renewal. These GMOs have been deemed to be safe, just as safe as their conventional equivalents, by the European Food Safety Administration. Anne Glover, who was President Barroso's chief scientific advisor, agreed. Major U.S. export interests are being injured, and EU food and feed business operators are seriously hampered in their ability to import much-needed protein-rich products used to feed Europe's livestock industry. President Juncker will be conducting a review of the legislation applicable to the authorization of GMOs. The outcome will indicate whether science will play an enhanced or diminished role in Commission decision-making. We hope the former will be the case. But tonight I want to focus on some areas of cooperation that will be familiar, as well as a few that maybe aren't. Let me start with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement. There's no doubt it's one of the biggest projects the U.S. and the EU have over the next few years. Tonight, I don't want to get into details of the negotiations and the substantial work that's been done over 7 rounds of negotiations. I simply want to make a few general observations about what we are trying to achieve before addressing a few misconceptions. Simply put, TTIP is about providing consumers with more choice and better products at lower cost. It's about growth and jobs necessary to provide work for the unemployed, to fund pensions for our retirees, and pay for the health, safety, and environmental protections our citizens demand. It's about providing business, especially small and medium-sized businesses, greater opportunity to export and to have access to cheaper inputs so they can grow and be more competitive. Much of what we're trying to achieve, and this is an important point, is actually a natural extension of what Europe has already done in the single market, without tariff walls in which goods and services can circulate freely. There are many vocal critics of TTIP, but there are none I have heard of the single market, because it's such an extraordinary achievement, which has been a source of growth and prosperity. Now, although TTIP is an ambitious undertaking, especially due to its focus on removing non-tariff barriers, both sides have negotiated many free trade agreements in the past, and we know from our own experience, including NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, that these agreements have in fact stimulated exports, high-paying jobs, and consumer benefits. Now, importantly, TTIP would also be of tremendous geostrategic importance, a point I think that is often overlooked, underappreciated. We should just talk about it more. TTIP will set a standard for future regional and global deals that reflect the value that we place on rules-based trade, high standards, and regulatory transparency and accountability. It would enhance the U.S.-EU global partnership in the realm of trade negotiations, helping us make progress in the stalled WTO talks, and ensuring that world trade rules will continue to be compatible with free market democratic systems. We have a window of opportunity. We don't know how long it will remain open, but it will remain open for a number of years, say 5, perhaps 10 years, to set a standard for future regional and global trade deals that reflect our shared support for rules-based trade, high standards, and regulatory transparency. If we fail, other countries who do not share our values and whose weight in the international trading system is growing fast will set the agenda themselves. Now, according to my dear Balliol College, Oxford classmate, Boris Johnson, I have to quote Boris Johnson here, quote, "There is nothing not to like about TTIP. As Churchill, he always invokes Churchill, as Churchill might have said, it is altogether unsordid. And yet many myths are being repeated, especially in social media, by those who do not want to let facts get in the way of a good story. Boris has put it better than I ever could. This is what he said in a recent Telegraph article. They say that the EU-US free trade deal will be a ramp for all sorts of undesirable American products. American chickens bathed in chlorine and so genetically modified as to possess 3 drumsticks per bird. Pale and tasteless American cheese that has been processed to the point of macrobiotic extinction. Fast American gas guzzler cars with seats that have been designed specifically for the supersized American buttock. They say that the notion of mutual free investment will lead to McDonald's being given the catering for the NHS, while J.R. Ewing will arrive in the home counties shouting yeehaw and insisting on his right to frack the place the kingdom come. You laugh, but I've seen many reports that come very, very close to this caricature. The myth that TTIP will lower European standards persists. Despite numerous academic studies, there's almost one new one every month, including by Europeans, by the way, they conclude the same thing. The level of health, safety, environmental protection are not necessarily any higher in Europe than in the United States. But the United States is not going to sell this agreement to Europeans. That is not our job. Europeans are going to have to sell this deal to Europeans. And it is time for certain European governments who have remained on the sidelines of the debate to start speaking up. It is time for more European businesses, especially small and medium-sized businesses, also to speak up. And it is time for the NGOs who criticize us for inadequate transparency in the negotiation to live by their word and to step out of shadows. They should step out of shadows and make clear by publishing detailed accounts for whom they speak and by whom they are financed. That is not clear today in Europe. The reason for Russia's opposition for TTIP is clear. The Russian state-funded and controlled RT television channel, formerly known as Russia Today, has just launched a news channel specifically addressed to the UK audience. It will no doubt spread its anti-TTIP message here. Now, why does Russia hate these negotiations so much? Professor Dan Hamilton of SAIS in Washington explains. TTIP presents a huge challenge to the Kremlin's efforts to divide Europeans from Americans. It offers something that the Kremlin cannot match, a transparent, mutually beneficial agreement that creates a rules-based framework for international cooperation, a reinvigorated transatlantic marketplace among highly competitive democracies would challenge the Kremlin's version of managed democracy, render Russia's own one-dimensional natural resource-based economic model increasingly unattractive, and consign its rival economic project, the Eurasian Economic Union, to irrelevance. The Kremlin also hates TTIP because it would facilitate the export of liquefied natural gas to Europe, thereby undermining Russia's ability to exploit its energy exports as a weapon to divide and to control Europe. That leads me to one other area of US-EU collaboration, coordination of sanctions against Russia. The Ukraine crisis, which has taken up a lot of my time, started with Russia's refusal, let's remember, and which continues to this day, to allow the Ukrainian people to choose their own destiny, including a free trade agreement with the EU. The EU and the United States are standing up for the principle of territorial integrity, the rejection of changes to borders by force, and respect for international law. Russia's actions represent a fundamental challenge to our shared values in a rules-based international order. They require a steadfast response and a willingness to bear costs. Russia's recognition of the so-called local elections in eastern Ukraine is a clear violation of the Minsk agreements and calls into question Russia's commitment to those agreements. But that's just another example in a long list of aggressive actions. According to press reports, Putin recently argued that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that divided Poland wasn't so bad after all. He has boasted of his ability to take Kiev in a few days. Russian forces have repeatedly violated Baltic airspace. Russian troops remain to this day in Ukraine, and Russia continues to train and equip the separatists with the aim of making this a frozen conflict. It is clear that the vision of a stable, democratic, prosperous Ukraine is for Russia not a dream, but a nightmare, because it would provide a model on Russia's own borders of another success story and would lead to unfavorable conclusions by Russia's own people about the direction of their own country. Over the summer, the United States and the EU were very successful in rolling out significant sanctions against Russia, notwithstanding the very different perspectives and vulnerabilities of the 28 EU member states. We need to keep the pressure up. This is no time for rolling back sanctions. We need to consider the possibility of expanding them if Russian aggression continues. Statements by some European leaders that sanctions don't work are simply contrary to fact. They are working. The ruble is at historic lows. In October alone, the Russian central bank spent $29 billion trying to defend it. Foreign direct investment has dried to a trickle. Interest rates have spiked to 9.5%. The Russian economy is now tipping into recession. And oil prices are now at roughly $85 a barrel, far below the levels that Russia needs to cover its outlays. And Russia's sovereign credit rating is at one notch above junk, with negative outlook. Although TTIP and the Ukraine are getting a lot of press attention, they are certainly not the only way that the United States and the EU are working together. So I just want to briefly talk about a few other areas where we're collaborating. First, Iran. In Iran, High Representative Ashton has shown remarkable leadership. The United States remains committed to working with our partners toward a long-term, comprehensive solution that provides confidence that Iran's nuclear program is exclusively peaceful. An initial step was taken with an interim plan of action, which provided limited relief of sanctions in exchange for Iranian steps that halted its nuclear program and rolled it back in key respects. The relief was limited, U.S. sanctions remain in place, and we continue to enforce them, an essential part of our dual-track policy to continue to maintain pressure on Iran in order to achieve a successful outcome of the negotiations. We remain hopeful that we can conclude a permanent agreement, and the negotiators are busy as we speak on that. The fight against ISIL and the issue of foreign fighters who travel to and from Syria and Iraq has also been a top issue for the European Union and the United States. The United States is particularly focused on building a common EU passenger name recognition record system and increasing the effectiveness of sharing information collected through the system with U.S. border security officials in order to prevent acts of terrorism by foreign terrorist fighters. The United States and the EU also are cooperating to increase cyber security. The U.S.-EU cyber dialogue has focused its efforts on promoting public-private partnerships with an emphasis on combating botnets, protecting industrial control systems, and in addressing market access barriers while continuing to coordinate on improving awareness of cyber issues. The United States and the European Commission are exploring closer cooperation in the field of standardization for the protection of critical infrastructure. This is critical to ensure a similar level of protection for our interconnected networks and also U.S. and European businesses operating on both sides of the Atlantic. European member states and the European Commission and the United States are collaborating as well to combat the Ebola crisis in Western Africa. The United States has already approved $360 million and has announced its intention to devote more than $1 billion. We already have a significant humanitarian presence in the region. We applaud the EU's ambitious commitment to reach 1 billion euros in collective contributions to fight the epidemic. And the United States is grateful for the UK's extraordinary leadership, which includes 700 treatment beds and up to 200 new community care centers in Sierra Leone. And that has enabled the United States to focus its efforts and resources in neighboring Liberia. In the fight against Ebola, U.S.-EU collaboration has been deep and highly effective. USAID and the Humanitarian Aid Agency of the European Commission coordinate daily, sharing information on the situation on the ground, strategizing how to encourage more healthcare workers to volunteer in the region, and identifying where our skills and assets can be complementary and mutually reinforcing. Finally, we have also been engaged in bilateral talks aimed at improving the lives of citizens on both sides of the Atlantic by increasing law enforcement cooperation. One of our big concerns is the anonymity of financial transactions through some virtual currencies, such as Bitcoin, and the challenges this poses to criminal investigations. Last week, U.S. law enforcement worked with 21 other countries and Europol to arrest 17 individuals for involvement in selling illicit goods through an online marketplace called Silk Road 2. This marketplace was used by thousands of drug dealers and other unlawful vendors to sell kilograms of illegal and harmful drugs, as well as firearms and other dangerous contraband. In addition, this law enforcement action shuttered hundreds of other online marketplaces and confiscated property and illicit cash proceeds. What used to take years to organize took mere months through the working relationship U.S. law enforcement has developed with European authorities. So I've mentioned a number of areas, some familiar, perhaps less so, where the U.S. and the EU are working closely together. There are many, many others. In fact, that's one of the things that struck me so much when I arrived in March of this year. Of the 160 people working in the U.S. mission to the EU, half come from the State Department. The rest come from almost every agency of the U.S. government, because everything the EU does affects in some way fundamental U.S. interests. The new EU institutions and decision-making procedures introduced by the Lisbon Treaty have made the EU a more effective voice on the global stage and a more effective partner of the United States. We need to continue to broaden and to deepen that relationship because, as I hope I've explained, in part at least, there is so much at stake. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you very much for that overview of a whole wide-ranging things from TTIP to Ukraine to Iran to Ebola to bilateral law enforcement and so on. I point out that we're very interested in the Regent's report to keep as wide as possible. So you'll find that some of our comments today will be on specifics, but please remember that we're ready to talk about anything about US-EU relations as the evening develops. So may I call upon Sanford Henry, please, to address us. And again, you have Sanford's CV. Sanford is particularly involved and interested in TTIP, and indeed his book on TTIP will be published within a month or so, I think.
That's correct. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, fellow speakers. And thank you, audience, for coming. I think this is a very topical topic. And I think that Tony touched on many of these points, which I think were really significant. My area of looking at this, and trust me, we're given a very limited time, and I think as Henry VIII said to each of his 6 wives, I won't keep you very long. The idea of Tony starting out with the armistice is very interesting, but I'm going to take a sort of a quick panorama across the trade history. And going from, the Vikings to the Dutch, to the French, the Italians. In fact, America was given an Italian name, which of course is a continuation of the Italians' ability to create a good name for a good design. The French, of course, in the American Revolution were very supportive and also made us a wonderful gift of the Louisiana Purchase for 4 cents an acre, which was and has always been part and parcel of a fairly big expansion of the United States. The Germans, of course, were there before there was Germany, in the sense that the Hessian troops were there fighting for the British, which, as you'll understand, of course, they're now still fighting each other in different ways. Scotland, of course, was a trading nation, mainly with Glasgow and shipping across the Atlantic for many, many years. And of course, there's England. And England, of course, developed different aspects of mercantilism going into capitalism, which of course was the effort, which was Adam Smith's great contribution. But they created originally monopolies going across the Atlantic. And so there wasn't really any EU. There were actually wars. There was the Civil Wars, there were the regional wars, there were World War II, World War I. The Iron Curtain, of course, we remember the battle with East and West when the Iron Curtain came down. And of course, the development after that became the coal and steel industry, and Jean Monnet was inspirational in creating something called the common market. The common market then developed itself and has expanded itself to now the Lisbon Treaty, which of course has made it, given it 28 countries all working together and creating an entity that can enter into negotiations on a bilateral basis with the United States. It's very significant because instead of having the World Trade Organization, which sadly since 2001 to 2014, the Doha round has not been a great success. In fact, with India blocking this last effort, it reminds me of Groucho Marx, who said that any club that would want me as a member can't be much of a club. So I think that the WTO has been somewhat discredited, but the other thing that has increased is the minilateralism and of course the bilateral. And minilateralism would be the NAFTA agreement, TPP, and then of course in the bilateral sector, which affects Europe and North America, CETA and TTIP. Now, Tony alluded to the 5 areas that Boris Johnson talked about: cheese, chicken, McDonald's, fracking, and butts. Now, I'm sure there's more in the treaty than these areas, and I'm sure that Boris somewhat understated it, which is unusual for Boris. The effort that they're doing in some of these areas, like the automotive, pharmaceutical, some of the specific, almost 23 different categories that are being negotiated with TTIP, merge actually existing entities. For example, in the pharmaceutical industry, FDA protects the consumers in the United States, and they have a very similar organization in Europe which does exactly the same thing. They use the same procedures, and so merging these two entities, using the TTIP as the vehicle to do that, is almost already being done. Everybody in England knows that Ford Motor Company started out in Dagenham, but it really started in Dearborn, and it was really one of those entities that is really cross-border and has been since the 1920s. Same parts, same designs, and a lot of these things that would go away in terms of the TTIP organization can already really recognize that they are already in place. So I think that some of the aspects of what this TTIP treaty can be, and they've gone through several rounds. I've participated in the ones in both Brussels and Washington, D.C., and they're working very hard to create, which is what Tony was talking about, which is a rule of law, in other words, a standard. And by creating a standard between Europe and the United States, they're also creating a standard for the world. In other words, it could be conceivably a global standard. They need each other in the sense of Europe meeting the United States, the United States meeting Europe, because of technological advancements, innovation, the advancements in Silicon Valley, the advancements that are taking place in Europe in terms of different aspects of nuclear research. There are a number of avenues which are already there, and the reference to Dan Hamilton, which I commend his new release also on transatlantic trade, which is just coming out this Friday. And they do a lot of this sort of work, which is quite important. But my main theme of why I'm writing about this, and the title of my book is called Only Trade Works. And the reason for that is that I believe that coexistence and commerce are much better than the past wars that people have had. And so it's really a way of creating an understanding, and if you trade with somebody, you may not necessarily go to war with them. And I think that that is the ultimate aim, in my view, of what TTIP can be. Coexistence in Commerce, I should say, was written by a mentor of mine, Sam Pizar, in 1970. And it was about Russia and the fall of the Soviet Union. And the way that the Soviet Union would fall was because of this cooperation that would be created by trade and by using trade. And it was, you didn't have to like the other fellow, all you had to do was cooperate with them. And so Coexistence in Commerce was the title of his book, which is something that's always been in my mind since I met Sam years ago. And I think that's the same today, in that if we can create this sort of working relationship between Europe and the United States, there are already the historic, cultural, linguistic, a whole series of reasons why Europe and the United States should be working together. But I think it's better that we do this together, and that TTIP can be fostered and certainly developed in some of the areas overcome where these 23 categories and 23 industries don't just look at cheese, chicken, butts, and fracking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanford, and I'm quite sure you'll see in due course when Sanford's book has come out how much time he spent over the last 2 or 3 years meeting everyone on this side and the other side of the Atlantic to bring together this very, very important issue. As I said, though, we're wider than just one or two things. We're looking at the whole relationship of the United States with the European Union. And I'm very pleased to ask our next speaker, Martina Bianchini, to come to talk with us. Everyone seems to be connected with regions in one way or another. Martina is a distinguished visiting fellow of the Institute of Contemporary European Studies. And I asked her what she thought that really meant. And she said, well, with my business background, I'm very happy to talk with students about the sort of things I know and to do it in an academic way which they will understand and in a business way that they will also understand. So Martina, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to share a European perspective on the ambassador's comments, because we have in the room here today students, alumni and guests, business, government and academia. And it really is the youth of today that are the leaders of tomorrow. And in that respect, it's very important that we all work together. And I would like to start off with citing what the ambassador said in his opening remarks. First of all, you said that we take a lot of values for granted. Europe and the US have worked together for a long time. And Europe and the US built two very strong economies on shared values, on the rule of law. Europe has built a strong social market economy. The US has built a strong free trade economy. Europe has followed, and it's built on the success and the rule of law. So we must not forget that both regions have worked together on shared values for safety, security, peace and prosperity. And then the ambassador went on and he cited several items on the political agenda: Ebola, nuclear, the Russian threat, Islam, and gave us some very good examples of where the cooperation between Europe and the United States is very good, and how it's kept us all safe, and that this collaboration needs to continue in the future because there is a lot at stake. Then the ambassador also talked about, the geostrategic importance, and in the TTIP, the world is watching. The other countries are watching what the EU and the US are doing. And what the EU and the US are doing has impact on third parties because we live in global economies, we live in an interconnected world, and the trade rules that are set here will impact indirectly and have consequences on the rest of the world. So the world is watching, and in that respect, it's very relevant, that the Kremlin not necessarily wants to see this new trade agreement or this partnership between the EU and the US happening. The ambassador made also some remarks about SMEs and really a benefit of SMEs, and called upon SMEs to speak up. And when we talk about TTIP, there's a lot of technical details. The negotiations, the details are being worked upon in technical working groups. The devil is in the detail. We all know it. And I'd just like to give one example, from an SME sector, which I have a product here, a scarf, and it's a scarf made by a Scandinavian manufacturer, a small SME, from Scandinavia. They like to sell online, and they're selling this also to American customers. But a couple of challenges for selling, this scarf online. It contains natural fur, which is part of animal origin. And when it's part of animal origin in the US, it goes to fisheries and wildlife, and that takes a lot of time. You cannot ship in 2 days, overnight, or Federal Express or DHL. So, as extra administrative burden, plus the US requires you to put the scientific name on the product, which causes a lot of confusion in the marketplace. And then, if you have to ship through fisheries and wildlife, it only can go to certain ports in the US, and therefore the product is rerouted to different ports, so it arrives at the consumer in the United States, 2, 3, 4 weeks later. Then actually we could have 48-hour delivery. And then the consumer may say, well, I wanted this 3 weeks ago, and now I'm getting the product, I'm going to ship it back, and therefore it takes another 4 weeks. So the SMEs that work in the in this part of the business on fashion, European fashion, they would welcome the TTIP, and they welcome the remarks of the ambassador that, this also gives opportunities for SMEs in Europe, to benefit from the exports, and we would be delighted to see some reduction of administrative burden or some help desk for the SMEs, because it's very complicated at this point in time for online sales to the United States. So that, the call for action that SMEs, European SMEs, should speak up, I think is a good thing, and I'm sure a lot of SMEs are speaking up, because the partnership is more about, the economy at large, and not only about multinational corporations, goods and services. I'd also like to comment on the myth, that the ambassador cited, with a bit of humor. And but when we look at the myth, it really shows, that people are value-driven, and the concerns that the people raise in Europe about the partnerships are, the jobs. Is it going to create more or less jobs? Some have talked about food safety, food security concerns, faster trade, lower standards, weaker oversight, is public health in or is it out of the TTIP, what about democracy, etc. The very fact that these things are on the agenda, to my mind, shows that people are talking about the unintended consequences of this, and they want to have reassurance, that the partnership actually is going to deliver. And when we talk about partnership, it has to deliver added value, because you enter a partnership based on common ground and not based on your regulatory divergences. But ironically, a lot of the debate right now is on the regulatory divergences, when we can only build a partnership on the common values that add value. And so in that respect, it's going to be important, to have a very good sustainability impact assessment, of what actually are the consequences of TTIP in practice. How is it going to work? Is it going to work as we all anticipate, or is there going to be some unintended consequences that you only see when you go drill deeper into the various policy areas, when one policy action might have consequences on another policy area. Because one thing that we see is that we talk about the single market in Europe and the federal market in the United States, and the EU-US partnership, would require that there is a single market on both sides. And we all know in Europe the single market is still not completed for all areas. So that is one of the challenges when it comes to the technical level. But the same is also true in the United States. The federal level has not all regulatory areas harmonized. Like on chemicals, there is federal legislation, but there are also state legislation. So in that sense, it's really the best, would be really good that the partnership focuses on the common ground where we all know it will deliver benefits and added value. And for that, maybe some good impact assessments on driving the investments into the right direction for longer term economic competitiveness of both of the regions, but also driving it into the direction of sustainable development, because Europe is built on the belief that economic and social progress are inseparable. That is part of our philosophy in Europe, and that is also true for the United States as it is for other regions. So hopefully we'll be able to put the best brains together and bring this thought leadership that is necessary to work on this extremely complicated and complex agenda, so that it can deliver all the things that are at stake, and that it can broaden and deepen the relationship on both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Martina, in the Regent's report, wrote one of the chapters. Indeed, it was on a slightly wider issue. It's about the European social model and the American way of life. And we are also looking in this seminar for the similarities and the dissimilarities between approaches to business and social affairs on both sides of the Atlantic. But coming next, but not last, to Dr. Fernando Guimarães, who has come from Brussels very kindly, as did the ambassador. I'd ask him, as head of the United States and Canada Division of the European External Action Service, to add his remarks.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening. I think I'm called to give I guess the European institutional view, but particularly the one on foreign policy, since that's where I work in the European External Action Service in Brussels. And perhaps that's the point I'd like to start with, and since Ambassador Gardner did refer to this as well, and make the point, as he did, that EU-US relations today are actually in pretty good shape. Not with all that's going on, and I'll get to that. But we do work today together to a greater degree and on more policy challenges than ever before. And as Ambassador Gardner kindly said, this is because EU post-Lisbon Treaty is actually a much better and stronger partner for the United States, with the network of EU delegations across the world and the External Action Service, but also the other initiatives to just get more joined up, and of course the Iran nuclear talks ongoing, but also the Serbian-Kosovo agreement in the Western Balkans are good examples of that. But this is not enough to address the big picture, long-term challenges that we have, both in the European Union and in the United States. The world remains a dangerous place with the rise of other powers. Both the EU and the US actually face the likelihood of long-term relative political and economic decline of power. And furthermore, over the last few years, we've had trying times, emerging from financial and economic crises finally, but still struggling to find answers to maintaining competitiveness, to creating jobs and growth, to fighting climate change, and to address insecurity, instability, conflict that is not far from our borders. So the question is, how do we, the EU and the US, develop and sustain a more effective partnership in order to tackle this difficult agenda? And what we need, I believe, is substantial economic, military and political commitment in the following priorities. First and foremost, we in Europe need to address the neighborhood and beyond. And the Ambassador has already referred to this, of course. The Ukraine crisis, first and foremost, is a major focus. Rising tensions along the border as we speak reminds us that this has not gone away, and that while we're not likely to see a major confrontation with Russia, we must work to ensure that the crisis is resolved peacefully. And to that end, as the Ambassador referred to, we have worked very closely together with the EU and the US, not least on the energy question, where, supported by the United States, the EU did work to achieve an agreement to ensure that Ukrainian gas supply persisted through the winter, and we continue this work, of course, in the face of ongoing tensions, but also the longer-term work of pushing for reform in Ukraine to modernize their sector and to use energy more efficiently. And the calibration of our sanctions was a very important point as well. Far more, perhaps, or as important as the impact of sanctions in and of themselves and separately, is the fact that transatlantic unity is there in the application of sanctions. And that's a very important thing to keep, as in fact, by quoting Dan Hamilton, we know that Moscow does not like it when we are divided. So we must continue to work on this Eastern policy as the European Union. Energy security is a crucial factor to that, and of course we have now a new framework for 2030 approved by the European Council to go forward with our energy and our climate policy towards that. The idea is to become much more a single market in energy as well, and I think that that's an important objective of the new Juncker Commission. News from the East that Gazprom is now going to build a pipeline to China is a clear sign that Moscow is doing its own energy security work and trying to reduce its dependence, because of course it is also dependent on Europe in terms of energy. Having mentioned the East, I think we can't forget about the South, the southern neighborhood, very crucial work. The High Representative was now in the Middle East. That continues to be a shared concern of the United States and the European Union. ISIL, as the Ambassador mentioned, but also the long-term work of being more patient in sustaining reforms in Morocco, a highly volatile challenge that is Egypt, avoiding state failure in Libya, and of course countering terrorism, addressing the challenge of foreign fighters, as the Ambassador mentioned, and the nuclear deal with Iran. All of this is the to-do list, lots to do, but that's the first priority. In addition to this, I think we need to build on this foreign policy cooperation by strengthening our security and defense capabilities and increasing what we do with the United States in this area. I think we still don't have the free-flowing security and defense cooperation that we should have across the Atlantic. We have problems, of course, in EU-NATO cooperation, not least because of Cyprus and Turkey stand-up, but there are other issues as well. But we really have come a long way since the days when NATO and European security and defense were in the same town, in Brussels, but on different planets. EU-US cooperation is increasing every year on this. We have now US contributions to EU missions in Kosovo and the Congo, and we must build on this further. We had a very good experience, for example, in the Horn of Africa, where the EU did different bits, the US did its own, to combine counter-piracy, security sector reform, get the army, get the jobs so that the pirates can go and do something else, and then, of course, the long-term development being linked up. So a very concrete example of how we can make a difference on the ground working with EU security and defense and the United States. So I think this is an issue, obviously, for member states to commit here in the Union. They must commit seriously to develop these common security and defence capabilities for both NATO and CSTP, because the ideological war is over, and of course we know where we're going. The December European Council and the Wales NATO summit have set the goals and set down the path, and the Ukraine crisis clearly shows the need for stronger capabilities. Perhaps I'll end my comments, which I'm sure I've gone on for too long already, but on TTIP, which I should come back to, because it is more than a trade deal, much more than a trade deal. Everything that's been said about the trade deal, of course, is a very important aspect of it. It is about creating jobs and promoting growth, but its geopolitical dimensions are very significant, and they have the potential of binding and strengthening transatlantic relations for the period ahead, in, as the ambassador was saying, what amounts to economic integration, but also asserting a credible leadership role for the transatlantic partnership in governance and in the makeup of what the global economy is going to be in the 21st century. So for you and for your children, this is what we're doing. And of course, it's got to be about getting a good deal for Europe. I mean, we want access to the US market for goods, services, capital and people. We want to grow and create jobs in Europe. But the significance and the implications of TTIP go far beyond this. And it is about increasing our leverage in a changing global system where EU and US economic and political clout is declining as other powers emerge. All we need to do is look at what's going on in Beijing, the APEC summit, and the work that China is doing to lash Asian economies to its own. So ultimately, TTIP is a trade deal, but it's also a political undertaking. It signals the commitment and determination of the partners to strengthen and stand behind their shared vision about how the world economy should be governed. It's important, nevertheless, to stress that TTIP cannot be seen as a strategic project to exclude other economic powers. That's not what we're doing. But it is a project to shape the 21st century economy. TTIP is a rising tide that will raise all boats, it will lift all boats, it will provide economic benefits more widely, and we can see in the Ukraine crisis a very specific example of how the geostrategic significance of TTIP can be seen. We can send a strong signal about how the trade and the transit of energy should be done across borders, and how international trade rules responding to principles of good governance, of transparency, pro-competitive regulation, free access to natural resources, for example, these are things that this is the way it should be done, and we'll put these rules in TTIP. TTIP has been rightly called a strategic bet on the transatlantic relationship, giving it renewed purpose and direction. And in fact, it would be the very first treaty ever to be signed by the EU and the US. And so with that in mind, I think it's very important that we work in the EU to make TTIP a success. It is now mired in the politics of trade, as the ambassador was saying. I think we need to inject the geopolitics into this mix and make sure that we don't lose sight of the greatest strategic significance. And the challenge that the ambassador laid down is for the EU governments to demonstrate that they are committed, that this is their policy too. I think it is also important for the US that a broader understanding of the strategic undertaking is necessary. But in the US, the focus seems to be currently on Asia. I think we understand that very well. We too should be and are. But a bet on the transatlantic relationship, on TTIP, will pay big for the US too, and therefore, of course, we look to the US to pursue its commitment to getting TTIP. I shouldn't end without saying that it is important in this regard, before getting near finishing TTIP, that we sort out the data protection issues that have been raised by the revelations of the NSA surveillance programs. These are issues that have had an impact in Europe, and they need to be addressed. But I want to recognize the very great efforts of Ambassador Gardner specifically, but also President Obama, in trying to sort this out, and we very much hope that will be the case very soon. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
thank you to all our four speakers. The thing that struck me most as they were talking was that there aren't really two regions of the world where one would talk about so many serious things at such a serious level as was covered here. Values were mentioned, whether it was democracy or rules-based society, whether it was political cooperation, whether it was security or energy or geopolitical issues and data protection. All those things are very, very big things, and if one thinks about it, one couldn't imagine a seminar like this between either the United States and other parts of the world or Europe and other parts of the world. There's a lot in common here. It's perhaps like an iceberg, only the tips show, but underneath the surface there's a lot to be discussed. And as we come to the discussion now, we have half an hour when I hope you would comment, question. Please keep your comments and questions as short as possible, and please also talk as broadly as you want to about any aspect of relations across the Atlantic. There's a question here for a start, and then one up there.
Do I need the mic? Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the panel for giving us such insightful perspectives. The beginning of the 21st century, of course, has seen the world geopolitics moving decisively, especially the geoeconomics, first of all, decisively from the west to the east. As we speak and have this conference, as we all know, there's a big global forum taking place in Beijing on the Asia-Pacific. Now, the emerging economies now account for over 50% of the world economy. And of course, China sits right at the center of this globalized trade and value chain. In fact, China trades with 127 countries in the world, compared with 76 in the case of the United States. And according to the latest research of the Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C., there are now more currencies moving in tandem with the renminbi compared with the US dollar. Now, my question is that talk about TTIP and talk about the transatlantic partnership. This doesn't change the reality that a lot of countries depend on China for their economic growth. And this kind of reality cannot be changed by military alliances or by treaties. So while this transatlantic relationship is very, very important, my question is that does the EU have an Asia-Pacific policy?
Thank you. Thank you. We'll take that as one of the questions, and we'll add one or two others. One at the very back there, please. And then there's one here. And then we'll ask for some comments on them.
Can you hear me yet?
No, not yet, but I'm sure we'll hear you in a moment.
How about now?
Not too bad. Just a bit better.
I can hear you if you want. Is that better? Oh, there we go.
There we go.
I'll keep it short. Amid the growing speculations of a divorce between the UK and the EU, where does the US stance on this? And if it were indeed to be a referendum, the UK would decide to leave the EU, what happens to TTIP? That's all. Thank you.
And we've got two questions here, and then we'll look at the comments.
Thank you, John. A very simple question. I'm Swedish, and we have some incursions in our air territory over Finland and Sweden and the Baltic states. Now, what is the US going to do if Sergei Markov, who's being interviewed today in Swedish TV and one of Putin's men, he said, yes, the Baltic states should be afraid, just like the Ukrainians. The Finns and Swedes, maybe not. And if they have a limited nuclear attack in Baltic states, what is not NATO and the US going to do?
Thank you, Carl. And there's a question just in front here.
All right, thank you very much. I have a question and a comment. First things, well, US and EU. Well, where we are now at EU stage, the development and the contribution of a number of countries, do we really need to trade in such way the whole European Union, depending on developing a relationship with the USA? where USA itself had a number of issues with international relations and geopolitical aspect. I mean, let me be frank. I want my EU to be more secure and safe because US have a number of activities in relation with Middle East, and even if you look at Russia, US, and even if you look at the current issues with the Middle East, a number of countries and West African involvement. And at the same time, we have issues with USA, China, and USA, India. So my point is, why should we go and threaten ourselves with this sort of, because we in many cases have to depend on developing nations and those sort of countries in production. So if we go for a EU-US relationship, it's actually jeopardizing a number of aspects with EU development. So I'm not trying to be negative, because at the same time I want USA to reflect a number of aspects on global cooperation rather than looking into Big Brother attitude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we've got 4 questions there. One about relations with China. We've got also the issue of the United States and Europe and the Baltic states after Ukraine. We've got the issue of the UK referendum. If the UK were to leave, what would be the effect on the European Union? And then what about relations with the rest of the world, not just US, EU, but with developing countries? I don't know if Fernando, you'd like to comment on those?
Sure. Well, I'll start with the question about China, which of course I alluded to as well in my comments, pointing to the east and towards what was happening in Beijing as we speak. Not as a sort of a spectre or something that should be countered or something that should be organized against, something that we should have a defensive or an offensive alliance, trade or otherwise against. Quite the opposite. But I do think that it's important to make the case that TTIP and the EU-US partnership is precisely the way of strengthening what we believe in is the way that an economic system in the 21st century should be run, and that we will sit down at the table with the other partners, of course China being one of them, and invite China and the other emerging and the other powers to precisely develop the system together. And that's, so it's not an exclusive, as I mentioned, project. It's one where we want to strengthen our arguments in the way that we see the way that the international economy should be run and what the rules are for the way that we should trade, for the way that we should have economic relations. So it's really not a West against the rest or a West against China. It really is about strengthening our own game better so that we're a better partner for the rest of the world.
Thank you. I think I'll ask the Ambassador to comment as well on this round, particularly on the EU and the UK and the Baltic states. And,
well, as for the UK referendum, it's clearly a domestic issue. It's for the UK people to decide what happens in the referendum. It's been called in 2017, but when asked, and we're often asked, the answer that we give is that we believe that, or we wish for the UK to remain in the EU because for 2 reasons. First, the usefulness of the EU as a partner for us in many of the global challenges is enhanced when the UK is an effective, articulate member within the EU. And the United States is not alone in thinking this. You have a lot of partners within the EU who feel the UK contributes a lot in terms of its perspectives. The Scandinavians, certainly some of the Central and East European countries, but not only them. There are many who do wish the UK to be part of the EU. But there's a second point here. I think that obviously we have strong ties, historic ties that go back a long way. But we think that the UK, one of the reasons the UK is such an attractive partner for us is the fact that it is a member of this larger organization. I think the EU would lose, and our view is that we think that the UK has defended its key interests within the EU, and certainly its core interests when it comes to financial services, quite effective. And that's our perspective. I can't think of any examples, significant examples, where the UK has failed to defend its significant interests in the EU. But these are issues for the UK to decide, no doubt about it. About the vaults, it's not appropriate for me to answer that. I'm not the ambassador to NATO. We do see the saber rattling that you referred to. All I would say is that there's an Article 5 guarantee that all members of NATO benefit from, and the Article 5 guarantee is very clear. And we can't afford to in any way dilute or question that guarantee. Which, by the way, I should say, for those who don't know, the guarantees that any member of NATO under Article 5, when attacked, can call upon all other members of NATO to come to its defense.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let's go to some other comments and questions. There's two at the back there. There's one at the front here. And there's one here. Two at the back first.
Mr. Chairman, I'm intrigued by the fact that we've got this far in the meeting on the TTIP side without any mention of the investor-state dispute settlement issue, ISDS. I hope, perhaps be wishful thinking, that may be because it is no longer regarded as a fundamental requirement in TTIP, given that it would mean that corporations would be allowed, as we know, to sue nations before a tribunal which would consist of corporate lawyers without any judicial review of their decisions. I was glad to see that Jean-Claude Juncker in his manifesto stated clearly that he would not support any dilution of the EU court's jurisdiction in such matters. So perhaps maybe things are moving in that direction, but could the panel comment, please?
Thank you. And there was a question at the back there, I think, was there? And there's one here. Yes.
I'll just use my loud voice.
Yeah, you can have a last speaker.
Oh, that's excellent. Whereas I'm Cornelia Meyer, whereas I'm an ardent supporter of TTIP and lots of other bilateral arrangements, my question remains: what is the future of the WTO in this increasingly bilateral world? Is it dead? Quo vadis WTO?
Thank you. There's a question in the front here. Yes, gentleman here. We will give you a loudspeaker so that you don't have to strain your voice.
You'll forgive me if I felt that there was a certain amount of mutual backstabbing this evening, but there were two aspects that concern me. It seems to me that EU agriculture has been quite hurt by the Russian sanctions in turn. One hears frequent responses from producers right across the EU saying that actually it has damaged them. Has there ever been any EU-American talks as to how this could be mitigated in that respect? And it also seems to me that the faint tone, or the tone very specifically tonight, was a feeling that these sanctions were working against Russia. But if we're surely looking at the mid to longer term, the only way it seems to me this is ever going to work is whether we have Russia back on side. I appreciate that Putin is probably a difficult man, but surely our mid-goals must be eventually to have people working in that respect, so we're working together on a mutual basis with Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take one more question and then comment. This is a question up there, the gentleman. Maybe a lady. It's terribly difficult to see with these lights, so I do apologise. Yes, I have.
Democratic governments need to be able to collect appropriate taxes. Are the US and EU cooperating within TTIP or elsewhere to tackle tax avoidance by global corporations? And if so, is the President of the Commission's heart going to be in that task?
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Anna Vukovic. I'm an alumna from Regent's American College London. My question is actually specifically aimed at Ambassador Gardner. And you said that the Russian sanctions are working and that the Russian economy is in a recession because of it. My question is quite simple. Do you really think it's a good idea to have one of the major world economies in a crisis so soon after 2008? And would there not be a better way to deal with this? Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if there's one more question, and then we'll ask, yes, the gentleman here.
So, we have spoken about the values of the European Union and the United States, the cooperation between the two countries, let's put it this way, or the unions. The one thing that I feel that we haven't mentioned here, despite the fact we mentioned Kosovo, African countries and everything, is the conflict on Israel and Palestine. How come that 70% of the UN states have officially recognized the state of Palestine, and the only ones that haven't is actually EU, the US, Mexico, Australia and Canada. So where does that put us on the world scene? And what message has Sweden just sent 2 weeks ago by being the first EU country to actually recognize it? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for all those questions. I think what we'll do now, if we may, is we'll ask our guest commentators today in reverse order to address any of those questions that they particularly want to. So we'd ask Fernando Ramirez first. Any other comments you have for a couple of minutes on the rest of the discussion today?
As far as the what is the future of the WTO crew of values, I think quite the opposite. We did reach a point where the multilateral trade negotiations were going in a direction which kept on passing open windows of opportunity that always seemed to close. So that is why we went the route that we did with the EU and the US. And it seems that the effect of TTIP and the effect of other initiatives have actually, at least in one occasion or two occasions, if we look at Bali, for example, the partial agreement there on trade indicated that this is having a positive effect towards contributing to the multilateral trade round, which continues to be an objective of the European Union. Since then, one of the major developing countries, emerging powers, has taken a different position, but I think the basic analysis still stands, and as far as the EU is concerned, the WTO development round is still a key objective, and TTIP fits very well into that. I think as far as ISDS, I'm not sure it was more of a comment, wasn't it? But I think perhaps some of our trade experts can perhaps address that. I'm not quite sure if did I miss a question? Did you want me to address one?
Well, just a couple of minutes, and then we'll do. You don't have to cover it.
Oh yes, I did want to address one thing about Russia. That's the one I want to talk about. I think. I mean, we are in a position where the actions of Russia on Ukraine cannot be accepted, and the game is still on. And therefore, what we're doing, as far as Ukraine's choices and facilitating Ukraine's survival at this stage, is something that we must do. And Russia wants to change the rules of the game, and of course that's is not acceptable. But of course, as far as Russia is concerned, it is a neighbor, and it is a reality. It's no longer a strategic partner for sure. I think it decided that it's not going to be a strategic partner of the European Union, as we thought we were heading towards. They decided not to be, but they are a strategic reality, so we must deal with them and be interest-led when we engage in Moscow. And of course, they are a player in the Iran talks, they are a player in the Middle East, and I think that is something that we have to be we have to play with for our own interests. And I think
Martina, would you like to comment on one or two of those points that you raised?
Yeah, just striking to see the discussion. We're talking about the future, moving into the 21st century and various partnerships, and it becomes obvious, that the challenges are just absolutely important, because we don't have only one global economy. We have hundreds of little economies and big economies, that operate simultaneously in the world today, and they're all interconnected with each other. And if you take action on one, it has effects on the others. So we have to find a way, to deal with this interconnected world, and we have to find a way that addresses, these wider concerns of the unintended policy actions on other policy areas, and that requires that the partnership on the TTIP is as focused and as clear in the scope, and brings the clarity that is needed, and has a thorough impact assessment done, because we know it needs to build also the trust, not only between the EU and the US, which come from very strong foundations and build on the shared values, but also with the rest of the world who is impacted by that. So then when it comes to the future of the WTO and multilateralism, is from the perspective of multinational companies, they are really multilateral entities, if you will. There are the only few global entities that truly can operate in a global multilateral way, and it is multinational companies. And for them, of course, a good partner is intergovernmental institutions. And to me, I see that it diminishes the need for the nation state, or on some areas, not on all, but on some areas. So in that respect, a regional partnership like between the EU and the US that builds on the strong foundation is really important, and it has to have not just this economic aspects of products and services being sold in one region or the other, but really the wider political aspect and ensuring the security and the peace for this region as well as the other regions. And that's really critical.
Good questions. The dispute resolution, I think, has been a part of most treaties that have been negotiated, and there have been hundreds of them, and this has always been included. So I think there's a valuable provision. I read in Private Eye that they were saying that this is really just going to be a payday for lawyers, in the sense that the arbitration business will grow, and that's of course another area to increase employment. But I think that the lawyers aren't just the only solution, and I think that they've made it very clear that they're not going to give away things that are going to affect the domestic or the state court system. And I know that Tony can comment on this probably more thoroughly. As far as is WTO dead, I think it's dying. I think it's had a very long career. It's gone from GATT to its current different rounds. In fact, I had a conversation with the new head of the WTO, and I said, maybe in order to make it live again, you should pick another city. In other words, maybe Cincinnati, or I don't know, maybe Lima. But at any rate, a lot of the cities have been tried. There's been Geneva a couple times, and so they've gone through different, aspects of how they are going to reconstruct WTO. But they perform an administrative function, which is really fantastic in the sense that some of these disputes that they have had have been resolved by the WTO, and I think that's been very effective. In terms of the EU and the bellicose aspect of whether Russia is, being subject and hopefully to get them back on side, I believe they should try and work on trade measures, and I think that it worked in the past, and I think that everybody, if they stop rattling their swords, but Putin doesn't seem to be of that mind, and I think until you see more of an undertow or the impact of these sanctions which take place so that the domestic political environment in Russia can have its impact when they're not getting the foie gras from Paris. Maybe then that will change the domestic populace and maybe create an opposition to Putin.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that. And can I ask the ambassador to finish our evening?
I'll be very brief. I just want to touch on a few points. ISDS is a subject that I love. I hate to admit it. I was a lawyer for many years. I was involved in quite a few international commercial arbitration cases, and there's so much misunderstanding about this topic, and it's hard to discuss it in 2 minutes, but there are a couple of wonderful reports that have been written. If you really want to dig into the details of this, I just commend a few things to you. There were 2 reports updated to June of this year done by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, because the entire history of ISDS mechanism, both who's sued, who's been sued, which countries, and those cases that are published, which is an issue you touched on when you used the word transparency, those issues that have been published, and it goes through all the statistics, and it frankly blows apart almost all of the criticisms that are made of this mechanism. Answering your question, yes, it is important. We're going to fight for it. And the Commission's going to fight for it, as absolutely they should. It's in the mandate that the Council gave to the European Commission. The large majority of the 28 member states are in favor of this, as they should be, because the EU member states are signatories to over 1,400 bilateral investment treaties containing this mechanism. And irony of ironies, Germany is the 3rd most frequent user. Investors from Germany are the most frequent users, after the Netherlands and the UK, by the way, of the ability to bring suit before arbitral tribunals. There's nothing in it that undermines the sovereign right to regulate. It just isn't so. Because the threshold for winning an arbitral case under most of the bilateral investment treaties is actually very high. There has to be either expropriation or quasi-expropriation or fundamental lack of due process. So one can sue, of course, one bring any kind of suit, as we could in national court, doesn't mean you're going to win. And I would just ask those of you who are skeptics about this and hear cases being referred to, and there are many of them, just to be a little bit cautious, because many of those citations are to cases that have been filed. They are not citations to cases that have been decided, which is very different. It is impossible to know how some of these cases, for example, the ones been filed by Vattenfall against Germany, because Germany decided to close down its nuclear power plants, how they will be decided. So yes, we're going to fight for it, it's necessary. In terms of the impact on the EU on agriculture, absolutely yes. Some of the countries have been very much affected. Poles, I think in particular, there's no surprises here that Russia custom-built its retaliation to hurt those who are most in favor of sanctions, and the Poles were, of course, the first one. But as you know, the EU has passed significant financial assistance, maybe not enough, but it has been significant. We have had talks to mitigate those impacts. For example, by facilitating exports. In some cases, well, I'll give you one example of apples and pears. We had a couple of large shipments of seafood to Russia that were turned back and then were accepted in Europe. How do we get Russia back on side? Well, we continue to offer what we call an off-ramp. I hate the term, but we keep on talking about it, and other possibilities to get Russia back on side, and to convince Putin that there is another way. There is another way to actually prove or show to the Russian people that they got something out of this crisis, i.e. heightened autonomy for eastern Ukraine. But it hasn't worked. And frankly, this is a long-term game, and we should be patient. Tax avoidance, very quickly, yes, absolutely. We are working closely together in various fora, including the G20 and the OECD, on the issue of tax avoidance or aggressive tax mitigation. Yes, Juncker presided in Luxembourg when many of these advanced tax agreements were signed, but let's be careful here. There's no suggestion of any kind of illegality. Many companies were involved in getting advanced tax agreements in the private equity world, which I was a member. It's absolutely standard practice to set up Luxembourg holding companies to do tax do tax planning. So I think a lot of the criticisms are frankly unfair, and I think we have to wait to see what happens under this new commission. Finally, in terms of the impact of these Russian sanctions on the world economy, let's be clear here. Russia is a very, very small part of the world economy. I think it's a small percentage, so I don't think it's going to have a major impact on whether we're going to see growth in the world economy or not. Is there a better way to deal with it? I think was one of the questions asked. Well, I would just ask for those of you who have a bit of time on your hands to put the following into your Google search bar. It is Valdai, V-A-L-D-A-I. It's a recent speech that Vladimir Putin gave to the Valdai discussion group, and it's must reading. It's long, it's somewhat, in parts, somewhat incoherent, but it is must reading because it is a exhaustive description of his worldview. And once you read that, you realize that we are not talking about a short-term issue here. This is a fundamental restructuring of the rules of the game, according to his perspective. And I think we just have to be patient and, again, offer him at every step of the road another way, and hopefully he will take it.
Ambassador, thank you very much. The other must-reading, of course, is the region's transatlantic relations, and you'll pick that up on your way to a drink and a reception. If we haven't answered your questions as well as we should have done, we look forward to meeting you there over a drink, and I hope you can meet your fellow visitors to hear from business, government and academia. I have just one last thing to do, which I can't see. Is Enrique de Brock here? Yes, he is. I knew he would be, but I couldn't actually see him. Enrique is one of our Students' Union representatives.
Hi everyone, and thank you for coming. As Professor John Rue gently introduced me, I'm one of the student representatives for the Student Union, more specifically the academic events part of the Student Union. And I would just like to take a brief moment to thank everyone for coming, especially the expert panel members who have given a great insight on a very interesting topic that definitely touches on all the students here at Regents who are very international. And also, I would really like to thank the US Ambassador for taking his time for coming here and providing us, with a great evening full of insightful, information. So thank you very much, and we're pleased to welcome you in Herringham Hall for a drink and, some nibbles and a great talk. Thank you.